sedition by the people, subjection to an enemy, supplication to the Lord, and salvation by a deliverer. And they go round that cycle 7 times in the middle section of the book. Then finally, the inevitable corruption that resulted from getting into this cycle. And it took the traditional form of idolatry in the north, immorality in the south. Idolatry in the tribe of Dan and immorality in the tribe of Benjamin. I want you to notice that particular. That's why I've underlined Benjamin. The book finishes with a statement that actually is the refrain of the book. It keeps coming in all the way through. There was no king in those days. Every man did what was right in his own eyes. Well now, let's just look at the first section. The compromise was twofold. On the one hand, God sent them in to destroy everybody in there, and we know how wicked they were and how perverted and how corrupt they were, how diseased they were as a result. Sexually transmitted diseases were rife in Canaan. And the more we know, the more we realize they deserved to be put out of that land. They really were terrible. In fact, God kept the Jews in Egypt 300 years until the wickedness of the Amorites was full. Meaning until they were bad enough to be put out. And God sent them in as the instrument of his judgment on a most perverted society. But instead of doing what God told them, they made allowances. And they allowed many people to live, particularly in the valleys. The Israelis only took the hills and the mountains, but they left the valleys alone. And so you had God's people up in the mountains, but pagan people and perverted people living in the valleys. The result was that they made alliances with them. And especially when the young men of Israel wanted a night out, they went down to the valley. And ever since Lot went down to the valley of Sodom and Gomorrah, you can guess the rest of the story. So you see, here were God's people up on the hills, but just the opposite down in the valleys. If holiness was up here, uncleanness was down here. And because they didn't clean up the land, that was a constant problem to them. The result was they got into this terrible cycle, because when you have mixed marriage, what happens when the clean and unclean come together? What happens when the holy and the clean come together? See? Somebody has said if you marry a child of the devil, you'll have real problems with your father-in-law. See? And I don't know how many Christian women who've married men who are not Christians, in the hope that they might be converted, regret it for the rest of their lives. Mixed marriages are not on, even in the New Testament. You marry within the people of God. But marriage is invariably, you see, it's like me standing on a table and you standing on the floor and me pulling you, trying to pull you up onto the table, and you trying to pull me down on the floor. Who's going to win? Well, you've got the law of gravity on your side. That's the problem. And if you have a mixed marriage, the law of spiritual gravity is with the one pulling it down. So this is what happens. So they soon got into disobedience, rebellion, and God punished them by bringing one of those enemies in up the valley and taking over. Once they were in that mess, they took the third step. They cried to the Lord and said, Lord, we're sorry, it's our fault, please save us. And he did. They went right back into it. It's as if you saved someone from drowning and pulled him out of the river and pumped him dry, and he said, oh, thank you, you've saved my life. And he turned around and jumped back in again. You pull him out again, and he says, you've saved me twice. I'm doubly grateful to you. He turns around and jumps back in the river. How many times are you going to pull him out? 70 times 7? I wouldn't. I'd say you don't want to be saved. And I'm afraid this is what happened here. 7 times they went round this cycle, and God kept raising up a charismatic leader to deliver them again. It's a cycle that God's people can get into. I want to major on this last section because that's fairly familiar to you. But you see, if you only look at the life of Samson or the life of Gideon, you miss this cycle. You miss the pattern. And that's what the book is there to teach you. Because God's people get into this cycle so easily. Even individual believers get into this cycle. They sin, they get into a mess, they cry to the Lord gets them out of the mess. 12 months later they're back in the same sin, the same mess. You known people like that? It's so easy to get into this cycle away from God. It's not only an endless cycle, it is a spiral going down. Once you get into this, it's not just going around in circles, you are actually going down in circles. And the last part of the book of Judges is a most unedifying account of what happened to the people ultimately. In both situations, one in the north in Dan and one in the south in Benjamin, you have the people of God being misled by a Levite, by a priest, a man of God, who gets into trouble and leads the people astray. It's tragic when the spiritual leaders of God's people get into a mess. Well, I've only got 5 minutes left for this talk, so I must hurry through the story. You'll have to read it for yourselves. But there are 2 examples here of decadence, of disobedience, of corruption, of pollution, moral pollution, and they are really stories that you certainly wouldn't teach in Sunday school. Up in the north, a man called Micah stole 1,100 shekels of silver from his mother, from his own mother, and then overcome with fears because she cursed the man who had stolen it, he gave it back, and she said, "You're a good boy, because you've given it back, I'll make a little silver god for you, and you can have it for your collection of gods," because her son was already collecting little idols. And the silver he returned, she had made into a god for his collection. What a mother to spoil her son that way. She was asking for trouble. And this son made his son his priest and said, "Now son, you see all these idols, you can be the priest and look after them." And that little boy was not even a Levite. So there it was. But a Levite priest running away from scandal in Bethlehem of Judea, of all places, ran to the north and actually lodged in this house for a night and said to this boy, "That's a nice collection of gods you've got there." And the mother said, the son, Micah, said, "Well, I'll give you £4 a year and board and lodging if you'll be my private priest." Because he thought, now I've got a real priest, I've got a Levite. And the man accepted the job. However, later, the tribes of Dan, who failed to take the land God had given them in the south, migrated north, and their leaders lodged in this house. They saw these gods, and they saw this Levite. And they said, "Hey, you just a chaplain to the family? How would you like to be a priest to our whole tribe? We'll pay you far more." The Levite accepted it. That's why the tribe of Dan became an idolatrous tribe. And just as Judas Iscariot, one of the 12 disciples, went missing, Dan is a tribe that is missing in the book of Revelation. And it all happened because of a Levite, a man who should have been a man of God, who for pay became a private chaplain, first to a family and then to a whole tribe. It's a sad story. And the other one is even worse, and with this we'll finish this talk. Another Levite, and again from the same tribe of Ephraim, took a concubine this time, a mistress, from Bethlehem of Judea again. Extraordinary. But she got fed up with him, left him and went home. After 4 months he went to get her back. And the father kept procrastinating and delaying. And finally the father let her go, and they set off too late in the day, and they got as far as Jerusalem, which was still a pagan city, and they said, "We're not staying with pagans, we must stay with Israelis." And so they pressed on to the tribe of Benjamin, got to Gibeah by nightfall, and were just setting up the tent when a dear old man in Gibeah said, "Well, don't sleep in a tent, I'll give you a bed for the night." So he took them in. And no sooner had this man and this concubine gone in that a crowd of gay men came to the door, knocked at the door and said, "That man who's come into you is very attractive, we'd like to have sex with him, let's have him." And the old man of Gibeah said, no, he's my guest. But you can have the concubine if you like, or you can have my daughter. And he pushed the concubine outside, and the gang raped her till the morning and treated her so badly she was dead on the doorstep in the morning. And they were so horrified that they took the body and they cut it into 12 pieces and sent a piece to all the 12 tribes of Israel. So this is what has happened in the tribe of Benjamin. And you know, funnily enough, for the very first time, all the tribes united. Isn't it amazing what unites people? And all the tribes united and met in Mizpah and said, we're going to deal with Benjamin for this. And they came, and for the first time there was civil war in Israel over just this one dreadful event. And it all started with a priest taking a concubine. It's amazing, one person led to civil war. And they slaughtered the Benjamites, and many Israelites were slaughtered. In fact, 1 man in 10 in the whole of Israel was killed in the civil war that followed. Benjamin, the tribe of Benjamin, was so angry to have their internal affairs being dealt with by the other tribes that they fought. And the result was, if you read the story, that the tribe of Benjamin was virtually wiped out. There were only 6 men left and no children. They were all slaughtered. So 600 men fled away. And then they realized what had happened to the nation. We were 12 tribes. Now we're 11. What has happened to us? They came to their senses. And they went raiding in Jabesh Gilead and found 400 virgins and brought them back and gave them to the Benjamite men and said, marry them and you can keep the tribe going. Still there weren't enough. They needed another 200. And typical casuistry, they arranged for the Benjamites to kidnap some Israeli girls at the next big festival at Shiloh, and they would turn a blind eye because they had sworn no Benjamite will take a daughter of ours as wife. So they said, kidnap them, and then we haven't given them to you. That's a typical way of getting round finding a loophole. Now all that, you see, is saying that this spiral went down and down. Look at the tribe of Dan and its idolatry. And above all, look at Benjamin and what finished off. Nearly wiped out a tribe of the people of God over one man's immorality. Well, that's how Judges ends. You see, there was no king in Israel in those days. And every man did what was right in his own eyes. Not wrong, right, but in his own eyes. You see, holiness is doing what is right in the Lord's eyes. So Judges ends with a mess, and it ends with that tribe. I want you to remember that. That's terribly important. Ends with a rotten tribe that nearly disappeared after 1/10 of the men of Israel had died. It's a sad story, isn't it? Thank God that isn't the whole book in the Hebrew Bible. And it isn't. A horrible ending for a book. Unfortunately, in the English Bible, that's what does end the book. Well, we'll break there and we'll pick up some better news in the next talk. We haven't finished with Judges yet. A little more to say about Judges, and then we're going to look at the other half of the book, which we call Ruth.